This particular teaching is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, verses 16 to 18. It's a parable that is known in many circles as the rich fool. I'm going to use that same title, and this will be part 1. The verses we'll be using. And he spake a parable unto them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, because I have no room where to bestow my fruits? And he said, This will I do, I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there will I bestow all my fruits and all my goods. And what he's really, you're dealing with a farmer who has had a bumper crop, as you will, and what he's going to do with his grains. Now, what preceded this? And this is the important thing. And this in the last teaching I had such a hard time, because if I spent too much time on that verse in the last teaching, it would render this teaching irrelevant and unnecessary. Well, the immediate thing that preceded this, what started the whole parable, was a gentleman upon hearing all the words of Yeshua, or maybe more correctly, hearing, but not hearing with the intent of listening or obeying. The words, they were an audible event that he was a part of, but perception may not have been there, because after Yeshua got done speaking these things on an entirely different course, as it would seem, comes out and he says, got an inheritance problem with my brother here. I need you to go talk with him and see if you can't convince him that he should give me my share. That's where we went with the last teaching, but just to bring you up to speed. And he said unto them, this is Yeshua, after he's been approached with this request of this gentleman. He says, Take heed, beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of things which he possesseth. So, this is where many commentators, they look and they say, okay, and they get it right. It's about covetousness. It's about greed. The Gospel of Luke, oh my, if you spend some time reading the Gospel of Luke, you will notice that he spends a lot of time talking about poor. Spends a lot of time talking about the rich. He talks about covetousness. He talks about greed. He talks about how the poor have God as their advocate, because that's who they have to rely on, because no other conditions exist whereby in a secular mind, in a secular way of thinking, or in a worldly way of thinking, that they might advance. But many of the commentaries that I read, they see this man who makes this request, and they have a habit of making the bad or the guilty extremely guilty. And that's what they want to focus on. They just want to say, well, this man, oh man, is he bad. And so they make the whole thing about covetousness. They make the whole thing about greed. Is it there? Yes. But it gets blown up to such a proportion that it's almost like they're putting this man on trial. Interesting thing. If this were a trial, that's where we see greed, coveter, guilty, right? This is where most commentators go. And if this were a trial, there would obviously be the prosecuting attorney showing you the bad of the bad guy, the guiltiness of the guilty guy. And they would make the whole parable about that. I would take this case as a defense attorney. I would do that today. Matter of fact, I'll do that today. I also noticed that I made everything in green, for envy or greed, as a little play on colors, if you will. And the opening statement would be unlike any other opening statement you've ever heard or ever will hear. Because the defense of my client would be a bizarre one. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I want you to consider, is my client guilty of greed? Yes. Is he guilty of covetousness? Yes. I submit to you that the prosecution will spend the entire case showing you that my client is guilty of these, and guilty of these on a gross level, a huge level. I'm not going to argue with that. But ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I submit to you that not only is my client guilty of these things, I would go so far as to say I'm guilty of these things. I would go so far as to say that every single juror here today is guilty. And you're thinking to yourself, well, no, I do this and I do that, and I've got this covered and I've got that covered. Really? Are you trusting God for retirement? See, because most people aren't. They're preparing for their retirement. They're saying, I need to put this away, I need to put that away, I don't have this available for that person for help, I don't have this available for that person for help, because I need to put this much away so that when I get old, I can retire. If in that point alone, you'd be guilty. Well, I need this, and I need that, and I need this. You need an amount which is enough to get by in this world. The rest is seed, and you don't know enough until you have too much. Once you have too much, right, you know what enough is. Well, unless you are properly, after the bills are paid, searching God out to find out what to do with that extra, you're doing the same thing as this man. We've all done the same thing as this man. Greed, covetousness, at its root, draws you away from a trust in God. It's a dependence on yourself, on what you can do, on your talents, and we've all done this. With this being said, God, the judge, is the only one capable of hearing this case. Mistrial. Let's move forward. I want to start with looking at a book, and I use a lot from this gentleman. I wanted to use more, but and I may in a later teaching on a certain point come back and make a point, but I need to study it out. I need to pray it out to make sure that it's a point that is worth making and is correct in God's eyes. But here's where we're going to start. He goes and he retranslates what we've seen in Luke 12:15, and he calls it a wooden translation, a very literal wooden translation. And he says, take heed and beware of every kind of insatiable desire, because not out of the surplus to anyone, the life of him it is, out of his possessions. He goes on to say, possessions are bonded to a deep, often irrational fear, the fear of one day, remember we talked about this, not having enough. You're either trusting in God for that, or you're not trusting in God for that, but at the same time, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Regardless of how much wealth is squirreled away, this gnawing fear presses frail humans to acquire more. There is never quite enough because the insecurity within never dies. See, there's things you don't know. You don't know if the leadership of your country is going to do something that devalues your currency. It might have been enough you might have been saving enough at a certain rate, at a proper rate when you started. But what if that currency is devalued? It's not worth the same anymore. What if you're thinking you're going to get gold? Well, what if in the day you retired, a bag of gold will buy a loaf of bread? That's going to happen. It's not nearly worth enough anymore. So it's a very real and present danger. It's something we need to be aware of. It goes on to say, this is the problem with insatiable desires about which Jesus warns his listener in the wisdom saying, life is not available in the surplus that these insatiable desires produce. In good Middle Eastern fashion, Jesus follows his wisdom saying with a parable about surpluses. If God is the owner of all things material and people are only his stewards, what rights do they have to the surpluses that their desires often create? So we live with this idea when we say to ourselves, oh man, if I could win the lottery. It starts there, right? If I could win the lottery, boy, all my problems would be gone. They'd be done. The idea that you'd have this huge amount of money. And then the funny thing is, somewhere past that initial thought is, if I could win the lottery, but it's got to be at least this amount, right? Then you start putting numbers on it. Gang, what happens to most lottery winners? They're broke. They find a way to spend the money. And some people say, well, I will start supporting ministries when I come into a huge amount of money. There's that thinking. If you're unfaithful to support the things that God's called you to do when you had little, you will be unfaithful to support the things God's called you to do when you have much, because it is an accepted behavior that you're comfortable with. You'll still have that accepted behavior. That doesn't change. That doesn't change. Well-known responses to surplus include, what are you going to do with surpluses? You're going to hide them. You're going to flaunt them. You're going to spend them on expensive vacation. You're going to get out of that neighborhood you live in. You know? You're going to buy expensive toys and go in debt. You're going to say, I'm entitled. I deserve this. I need to do something for myself. Here's a biggie. You're going to buy more insurance. You're going to pretend you are poor and just scraping by. Why? So those people leave me alone. Right? Because you're going to have friends you never knew. And realistically, you still don't know. Because they're not your friends. You're going to use them to acquire power. Here's another thing. The man in the parable, he's already rich. Right? If it's an insatiable desire, you never have enough. Because the insecurity will always exist. That calm, that peace that you can have is from abiding in God, in trusting in God, being faithful with what you have to do what He's called. If you're going to try and do it the worldly way, you'll never have enough. I posted up on Facebook about a guy who, had all the riches in the world and everything else, and he's talking to the doctor or the psychiatrist, saying, none of it makes me happy, I just don't know. And the psychiatrist is asking him, what kind of car, and he describes, and what kind of job. He describes the type of money. He describes it. Finally, the psychiatrist says, but do you have a Rolex watch? The guy goes, well, no. Thinking, that's obviously the thing that's going to make him happy. There's always going to be one more thing. There's always going to be one more thing. The man in the parable is already rich. But look at this. Did the work that the man did, is that what produced this huge bumper crop? I want you to think about that. I want you to answer that right now. I want you to think about that. What'd you come up with? It says the land yielded the fruit. We're going to get into that in a little bit. We're going to get into that. He did not work harder to produce his bounty. It's a gift of God. What will he do with the surpluses? If God gives you a gift, will you honor him with it? Will you say, you know what? I've been pretty good in my faith. I got a lot of faith. I do a lot of good works. I deserve this. Or are you going to say, wow, I'll be able to do this for the kingdom? I'll be able to support this. I'll be able to support that. My only question is, what would God have me do? Which questions are you asking? It's going to tell you where you're at. And he spake a parable unto them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully, or abundantly, as some versions might say. What do we know? We know he's already rich. We know the ground prospered, not him. Well, look at this. Remember my opening statement in the trial? Think about that as I read this. You have heard that it has been said, you shall love the neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. Here it is, guys. He makes the sun to rise on the evil and on the good. You going to need sun for a bumper crop? Okay. What do you do that brings up the sun? Got a little dance you can do? Got a little song you can sing? No. What else does it say? And he sends rain on the just and the unjust. In addition to the proper soil, with the proper nutrients, you need sun and rain, don't you? Who controls that? God. God controls that. Everything you can do that you should do, the Torah has a number of things listed. Because when you read the first 5 books of the Bible, the instructions in the Word of God, the way you should honor Him, the way you glorify Him, the way you should live your lives, a lot of it deals with agriculture. So whether you believe in Him or whether you don't believe in Him, if you follow those instructions, you're going to be successful. Because the Word of God is true. So if you follow those instructions, many of the old-time farmers realized this a long time ago. They didn't reap the corners of their land. And they left that for the fatherless. They left that for the widow and the orphan. Just take as much as they need. Because they knew God told them to do it. And they did it. Whether they believed, or shall I say, accepted, or hadn't accepted Him, they knew God said it. Well, here Yeshua uses it in this context. He says, for if you love them which love you, what reward have you? Do not even the publicans do the same? This man has taken God out of the equation. We're going to continue to show that. And yet has a bumper crop. At the same way, when he says, you know, um, you love those who if you only love those who are good to you, what kind of testimony is that? It's supposed to be good to God, those who aren't good to you, right? Just like, and that's one of the reasons I didn't want to come out like many of the commentaries and just attack this guy for greed. The scriptures in Matthew are the very reason I opened with a defense and why I'm looking at the root of greed and covetousness. Here's something interesting. Um, Palestinian farmers were heavily dependent on rainfall for the success of their crops, a 5-month dry season. Now, granted, I've got this up in a way that everyone can understand, but there's a certain Hebrew season here, and we're not going to get too much into that. I don't want to get off course. But 5-month dry season left the land baked hard, and it was not until after the early rains, and you've got the season there, that the ground could be prepared. Most of the water was provided by the heavy winter rains, but the latter rains were necessary to bring the crops to harvest. You can't do anything to make it rain or make it not rain. You're totally dependent upon God. He's the one who does this. And we got from this book, it says it is widely acknowledged that the economy of Palestine in the Second Temple period, like the economies in the surrounding regions, was based on agriculture and was mostly subsistence. Most producers worked on the land and consumed most of what they produced. We got a phrase for that. What do we call it? Just getting by, right? As in the study of the economy of the larger Greco-Roman world, what is disputed is the extent of surplus produced over and above the subsistent needs of the peasant family, how that surplus was produced and circulated, and who benefited from the production and circulation. Many recent studies in the economy of Palestine are influenced by works in economic anthropology and social scientific studies of peasant societies. You keep noticing the phrase peasant. You don't think of somebody who's doing very well, do you? They are dominated by the primitivist model of the ancient economy developed especially by Moses Finley. According to this approach, Jewish society composed a vast majority of peasant producers and a small minority of elite city dwellers. Peasants survived on the barest minimum. There was little left over, and the small surplus they produced had been taken from them by the elite as taxes, rents, and tithes. The elite were the ruling class of Palestinian government officials, military personnel, priests, and other temple functionaries and intellectuals. These and their subordinate retainers either were not directly involved in agricultural production or did not produce enough for their needs. They derived their livelihood and wealth from the labors of peasants on the basis of status-driven legal claims without any exchange of return values in goods and services. This urbanization of Palestine is typically viewed in negative terms since cities were centers of consumption rather than centers of manufacture and trade, with a parasitic relationship to the countryside. What's interesting is, let's think about this guy. Obviously, he was following the instructions of God, or he wouldn't be a rich man in agriculture. He's following the instructions of God, or his land would not have yielded a good fruit, or a good crop, a good surplus, if you will. But if these conditions that are described over the previous pages that I have read you exist, would there be a concern in a worldly manner that, yeah, I'm doing good for now, but it might not always be that way? Do you see where that type of thinking could exist? Where that type of reasoning could come about? That's one avenue. Later in the parable, he's not going to take this avenue, though. The avenue he's going to take is, oh my, This is amazing. This is amazing. I was doing well, but now with this crop, I don't ever have to worry about being in that place again. Matter of fact, oh my, can I celebrate now? What a joyous, joyous event. I, with my skills and my talents, had brought forth an abundance, and oh, am I going to celebrate? I can afford to celebrate. I can afford to live the life that I deserve. Wow! That's a real and present danger for anyone, not just this man. And where it says, take heed in Luke 12:15, it goes back to the Hebrew word shamar, which not only means to observe, to guard, or to protect, but to protect something extremely valuable to you, something that is of the utmost. And it usually deals with the instructions of God. To protect, to hold dear, do not let anything pervert or destroy or to diminish those instructions. And you see the dangers that greed and covetousness can, if allowed in, and it's allowed in from trusting in yourself and taking God out of the picture. This is amazing. I always want to bring this up in teachings, and I can never find where it is, but I always remember that I've read it and I've preached it. I found it. Praise God. He showed me where it was. There are 3 keys kept in the hands of the Holy One, blessed is He, and they were never given over to an agent. They are the key to reign, the key to childbirth, and the key to resurrection. Babylonian Talmud, Ta'anit 2a. Let's talk about the ground. It's not a case of riches acquired in any unlawful manner, but of riches derived from industrious labors and the bounty of heaven. Mere multiplication of his wealth and selfish enjoyment of it take up all his thoughts. Remember we talked about this. He says, my fruits are basically my grains. In verse 18, it's my barns. It's my fruits. It's my goods. And in verse 19, it's my soul. Where's his mind? I, me. Sounds like a lot like somebody who used to reside on Pennsylvania Avenue. Moving forward. This is a parable on covetousness and on this deadly vice in its most innocent-looking form. The man is thus painted in fair colors, and we may expand the picture as much as we like. Even his covetousness has nothing repulsive about it. He has just lived for these earthly things, and they alone filled his life and soul. That was all. The world has any number of duplicates. You start to see why I'm coming out in defense of this guy, and why I'm saying we're all guilty. It becomes more and more obvious. The ground of a certain man brought forth plenty. The unhappy subject of the Lord's story was a common figure in Palestine in an ordinary, prosperous time. We have the portrait of a landowner whose farm does not seem to have been acquired by any unjust means. This man, after years of successful industry, having acquired great wealth, wholly devotes himself to it and to its further increase. In Egypt, in the Fertile Crescent, the Nile was a great provider. So much so, people didn't thank God for the provisions of the Nile, did they? What did they do? They made it a god. And Pharaoh, of Moses' time, made himself a god above the Nile. Very interesting. He does not give himself up to excess or, well, there's a word I don't use, profligacy, but simple body and soul becomes the slave of his wealth. Isn't that interesting? You literally become slave unto your own your own desires, your own unchecked thoughts. Utterly, hopelessly selfish, he forgets alike God and his neighbor. Well, that's very interesting. Because the summation of the Torah and the prophets, the idea of what the Torah and the prophets teach is one, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Gang, which is the Shema. And the other part, to love your neighbor as yourself, is taken from Leviticus 19, what we would call verse 18. The idea is that if you understood those things, you understood the entirety of the Torah, what it was trying to teach you, what those instructions were trying to teach you. This guy apparently has a poor understanding of what everything's about, doesn't he? He's forgotten God and his neighbor. Because, gang, I guarantee you, he's got a neighbor that needs help. We already showed times were tough. So in a sense, greed and covetousness, you can say, well, that's just a violation of Exodus 20, verse 17. But in actuality, you can say that it is a violation of the heart of Torah. Luke 12:17 to 18. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, because I have no room where to bestow my fruits or grains? And he said, this will I do, I will pull down my barns, and I will build greater, and there I will bestow all my fruits and all my goods. Now the thing you want to be very careful of is there is a minimal amount of detail given here. So that you can't say, well, yeah, and also he didn't doesn't show anything about how he supported his servants, or doesn't say about what type of silos he had. Because where I find that interesting, because in the silos, believe it or not, they also had underground silos. And the idea behind the underground silos, one, it's going to be harder for the taxman to determine your wealth and your taxes. And two, it's a way to protect things, because it's very hard to break into something if you don't know it's there. So the idea, along those lines, I'm very surprised that Yeshua didn't mention that in there and talk about underground, because that was there, but it's not there. So we can joke about it, we can laugh about it, but we can't read in because it's not there. That's just one example of reading in something that's not there. So be very careful, especially in Luke. Luke doesn't give you a whole lot of details. You can only teach what's there. The man believes that what he has is his in no uncertain terms. So in other words, he doesn't really see himself as a steward, does he? Doesn't acknowledge God because he feels it's his. We'll get into that. Several times in the next few verses, he speaks in the first person terms about what he has. My crops, my barns, my grains, my goods, myself. Right? No hint of an awareness of stewardship or responsibility to others as a result of his fortune. There is only self-interest. Luke 12:18, 19, but you're also including verse 17. The word I appears 6 times, showing the selfish focus of this man has as a result of his fortune. So this wealth, being his spirit wasn't totally in check with God, wound up being more of a cursing than a blessing, didn't it? And that's the thing. We have so much in this day, in this age, in which I'm preaching this. There's so much envy towards the wealth. People who have succeeded, people who have made wealth for themselves, that they themselves have become evil and misrepresented. It's not a problem to have achieved success, to have wealth, or to be wealthy. But if you're not honoring God with that wealth, you know what it's like? It's like having one of those big box fans. If you're not honoring God with your wealth, set it down in paper bills and turn on that big box fan. Make sure you're outside when you do this. And place all your bills right in front of that huge fan and watch as it blows away. If you want a visual understanding of what happens when you're not trusting God and when you're not honoring God, there's your visual. Because it's going to blow away. It's going to disappear. It's going to be someone else's. See, this guy's plan is to store abundant resource for himself, as though the assets were his alone and should be hoarded. This focus on the self is what Yeshua is trying to get through to this man. Now, the sixth time that you're going to find the I is in verse 19, and we're not going to be covering that this week. There's another time where there's 6 I's. The reason I say it's I is because this is a community. So as a community of like-minded, we do use the word us and we, because this community is like-minded. You will see that. And so that I and a we are equivalent, aren't they? How can I say they're united? And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from their east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there, and they said one to another, Go, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the whole face of the earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. The Tower of Babel, a ziggurat, if you will. And a ziggurat, on each level of the ziggurat, was dedicated to a different god. It was built as this huge tower. See, because something happened not too long before where it's still in these people's minds. What was that major event? It's a flood. God's not going to flood us out again. See, because we're going to build this huge tower. It's a ziggurat, if you want to look it up. And it is going to reach to the heavens. And we're going to make a name for ourselves. Because you will not do this to the unity or the brotherhood of man. Who's their God? Themselves. Have they taken God out of the picture? They've not only taken God out of the picture, and that's why I bring this in, because these people had the same I mentality, this me. They've not only taken God out of the picture, they've tried to render him irrelevant. How do you think it turned out? Well, let's find out. And the Lord said, Behold, this people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, in other words, for their own protection, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to go build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. You want to talk about people, they are under the impression, as Mr. Marcion was, that this God of the Old Testament, big, mean. This is a warring God. This is a killing God. This is a judgmental God. This is a sin and you will get kicked in the pants God. And he would believe that. But you want to see a loving God? You want to see a merciful God? You want to see a graceful God? You need to look at the New Testament, they would say. Now, Marcion has been shot down in pretty much every congregation and every denomination of Christianity. But in many ways, the heart of Marcion lives on in many of their teachings. In many ways, the Old Testament is never taught. When every book in the Bible, gang, whether you can accept this or not, you will eventually, God willing, is a commentary on Torah. That's what everything is about, and everything funnels through. Merciful God? A gracious God? He didn't destroy them! Look at what they have done! They had relegated him as completely and totally irrelevant, as nobody. They just didn't build a tower with every level dedicated to another god, to another form of paganism. They didn't need him because they were their God. For their own good. He confused their language so they couldn't hurt themselves. He scattered them so they couldn't hurt themselves. Because if their languages are confused and they are scattered and they can't pollute one another, then there is the chance that he can reach down and reel these people back to himself and restore them. Okay, if that isn't grace, if that isn't mercy, if that isn't chesed or loving kindness, then I don't know what is. Let's look at another example of this I, me, because we've already seen where it's rendering God irrelevant. I've been nice to this guy so far, but he doesn't even realize that he's rendered God irrelevant. These people openly and knowingly did it. Does this look familiar? How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. North is the only direction in the Bible in which evil is mentioned with, and north is almost always associated with judgment. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. Boy, I could spend all day on those verses. There's so many things that ties into. What I do want you to understand is when he says, How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? If you look before, who you're actually dealing with is the king of Babylon. But the king of Babylon, in his actions, in his words, in his manner of living, was so vile that he himself was a picture, a very clear picture of the adversary. He's such a clear picture of the adversary that the Bible is able to talk about him and the adversary as what? Either like or interchangeable. That's not a picture you want to be. This guy is another person. It was all about him. Matter of fact, he was going to be higher than God. He was going to be more powerful than God. By default, what was he going to do? Render God irrelevant. dangerous thing, wouldn't you say? Next. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do? From Luke 12:17. We know four things about this man's contemplation of the problem. They are the counseling in his contemplation, the continuous of his contemplation, the character of his contemplation, and the cognizance of the contemplation. This is an amazing resource that this author has come up with. I really thought he hit upon something. The first one, the counseling in his contemplation. He thought within himself, this farmer counseled with himself about solving his problem. He did not counsel with God. There is no mention in our text that he ever sought the counsel of God in his problem. We continue the theme of God being irrelevant in his life. The continuousness, oh boy, I had a few extra syllables, of his contemplation. The man was constantly thinking about his wealth and the perplexity it was causing him. The continuous nature of the farmer's contemplation about his wealth is emphasized by the verb tense of the word translated thought. This word in the Greek is in the imperfect tense, which means the farmer was continuously thinking about his wealth and his problems. The character of his contemplation, the farmer's thoughts were very lacking in character. This is seen in the fact that they lacked gratefulness and they lacked goodness. He hadn't acknowledged the goodness of God. How had he not acknowledged it? There's no gratitude. The cognizance of his contemplation. As our text for this parable shows, God was cognizant of all this man's thoughts and responded to this man's thoughts. And because the thoughts were not good thoughts, God's response was not a blessing but a curse upon the man. Remember, I said in one way or another in our lives, we need to check and make sure we're not guilty of this. Let's not spend so much time attacking a man whose heart wasn't in the right place. Spend more time looking at ourselves. Matter of fact, what I think came to everybody's mind when we hear this is Deuteronomy 8. I want to look at all 20 verses of Deuteronomy 8. And since Devarim was around long before Luke, I'd say the parable is a commentary, a midrash, if you will, on Deuteronomy 8. All the commandments which I command thee this day shall you observe to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Lord swore unto your fathers. So what's the very first thing we're saying? Here is a key for success, right? And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart. In other words, God's showing these people, saying, okay, I want you guys to truly be happy, to truly be content. But first, you need to see where you're at, right? Because if you see where you're at, now you're presented with a crossroads. Fix it, let it slide, right? And God's instructions are going to show you how to fix it. It says, whether thou would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled thee and suffered thee to hunger. When are you most likely going to call out to God? When you have need, when you have want, when you have desire, is when you are most likely going to thank God. And many, upon the immediate receiving of that hunger being fulfilled, many will thank. They'll thank immediately. But will that be a lifestyle that continues? Because this is what he's talking about. And he says, and he fed thee with manna which thou knew not. You never seen anything like this. Neither did thy fathers know, that he might make thee know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God does man live. So what would you hunger for? More of God. You never seen anything like this before. Matter of fact, your forefathers never seen anything like this before. Because God is trying to create a situation to where you will hunger for more of Him, so He can guide you, so He can lead you, so He can instruct you, to truly show you His love, His mercy, and His grace. He's trying to bring you into that place. He says, your clothes, they didn't get old. The ones that you're wearing, neither did your feet swell. These 40 years, you're walking out in the desert. It's hot out there. Everything's holding up. That's a miracle. Thou shalt also consider in thine heart that as a man chastens his son, so the Lord thy God chastens thee. This is the father-child relationship. And he's saying, yes, there are going to be times I have to do this. But these instructions that I gave you, they're to guide you, they're to lead you, they're to perfect you. They are for your good. And when you deliberately decide that you don't need them, or you know better, or you're going to go another way, or maybe you just made a mistake, because He loves you, He corrects you. Therefore, thou shalt keep the commandments of the Lord thy God, to walk in His ways, and to fear or reverence Him. For the Lord thy God brings thee into a good land. You know, Hebrews could also be a commentary on this, where it talks about, the book of Hebrews that is, where it talks about in order to come to God, you have to believe He's a rewarder of those that diligently seek Him. He's showing that right here. For the Lord thy God bringeth thee into a good land, a land of brooks, of water, of fountains, and of depths that sprang out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates. Remember, He allowed you to hunger to show you that He's the only one who can truly fill that hunger. And look at the things. All these things are the things that you could imagine, and He's bringing them. A land of oil, olive, and honey, a land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness. I'd say this is a bumper crop, wouldn't you? Thou shalt not lack anything in it, a land whose stones are iron, and whose hills thou mayest dig brass. And here it is, gang. This is Deuteronomy 8:10. This is the pivot point right here. You want to get this verse. You want God to place this verse on your heart. You never want it too far away from cognizance, from realization, from on your tongue. Because this is the most dangerous time you will ever be in. When thou hast eaten and are full. That's the time you don't feel like blessing God. Right? Many people have simply taken this and they said, well, this is why we say our blessing after the meal. This is a lifestyle. Anybody can pray to God when they lack. They can be grateful to God when they lack, and it is immediately fulfilled, or while it's in the process of being fulfilled. But what happens when it's actually full? You become comfortable. You come to the place where, yeah, well, it was probably me who did it. It wasn't really God. I mean, I deserved it. I was entitled. I'm a good person. It was me. That's the most dangerous time you'll ever be in. Matter of fact, in our Seder, there is a blessing after the meal where you give thanks. I've taken it. I've thrown the standard one. I've kicked it to the curb. I took it from this chapter. as a reminder, and I formulated that blessing from this chapter for that reason, as a reminder that it should never be far from your lips. When thou hast eaten and art full, then thou shalt bless the Lord thy God for the good land which he hath given thee. As you look back over your parable, did the farmer do that? He didn't bless God. Never once. Doesn't even mention him. By the fact that it's his life, his barns, his crops, right? He's rendered God irrelevant. That's not thankful. That's thankless. Let's go on to see what it says. In 11 to 15, beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God in not keeping his commandments and judgments. Isn't this amazing? Because so many people, denominations, they say, well, the law is dead. This is this hurts to say. It's a horrifying thought. Because one of the ways you forget God is not keeping his commandments and judgments and his statutes. Does it mean you're not saved? No. But it does show a lack of gratitude, doesn't it? That's a dangerous thing. Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God in not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes which I command thee this day, lest when thou hast eaten and art full, and hast built goodly houses, or put up bigger silos, and dwelt therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied. Are you seeing that, farmer? Then thine heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led thee through that great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents, and scorpions, and drought, and where there was no water, who brought thee forth out of the water of the rock of flint. The farmer has done this by the fact that he's thinking about himself and himself alone. And this is talking about when you're in that place and you forget God, what are you forgetting? What are all these things dealing with? The goodness of God, God's love, God's loving kindness, the mercifulness of God, the protection of God, the loving Father, the loving groom. He's simply, it's not necessary. You've rendered all that irrelevant. That's a painful thing. Let's see how it ends. Who fed thee in the wilderness with manna which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee, and that he might prove thee, to do thee good at the latter end. Wow. Dad wanted you to finish that race, didn't he? He wanted you to finish strong. And thou, what'll happen? And here's the farmer. And thou say in thine heart, my power and the might of my hand has gotten me this wealth. And when that happens, you did it. You're not it's not God's. You think it's yours. You think you've done it. It was your talents. This is why I spend so much time on God raises the sun. God brings the rain. No matter how talented you are, you need him. You're going to say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has gotten me this wealth. But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he swore unto thy fathers, as it is this day. And it shall be, if thou do at all forget the Lord thy God, and walk after other gods, and serve them and worship them, I testify against you this day that you shall surely perish. What happens in this parable? You fool. Tonight, you die. And all this stuff that you think you've acquired by your hands, the things that you think made you rich, they won't be going to you. You don't know where they'll be going. Probably handed out to people who think they're entitled. Wow. I testify against you this day that you shall surely perish, as the nation which the Lord's destroyed before your face. In other words, you were there. You seen God protect you with supernatural signs and wonders. By night, there was a pillar of fire. It was a guiding light, if you will. It kept you warm. By day, there was a cloud. And those who were pursuing you, remember back in the Exodus, could their weapons that they hurled at this cloud, did they get through? That was an impenetrable defense that he had protecting you. What did you have to do? Continue following it. Where he went, you went. When it stopped, you stopped. He kept you cool in the day. He kept you warm in the night. And completely and totally protected. Gang, that sounds like an obvious place to be. I'm going to go over again and say, and it shall be, if thou do it all, forget the Lord thy God, and walk after other gods, and serve them and worship them. I testify against you this day that you shall surely perish. As the nations which the Lord destroyed before your face, so shall ye perish, because you would not be obedient unto the voice of the Lord your God. In closing, as but a shadow each one walks. They busy themselves only in vain. He heaps up wealth, but knows not who gathers them. And now, Adonai, what do I wait for? My expectancy. My expectancy is in you. Psalms 36, 6-7 from the TS 98 version.